You can get a lot out of your internal clients by just spending like a little bit more time with them, right? Like I just have to do things in a less amount of time. I don't know how else to do it. Nobody wants to hear you talk about the law other than lawyers, like no at all.
We are back with another episode of the What You're About podcast with me, Chad Abood. And we've got a cool one here, especially for me and my background too, deeply resonant from a soccer front, a sport front. Manav Deol, you played it, which I resonate with, but then you took it a couple steps further in your career, which I actually had a failed entrepreneurial journey that related to sports, and you did me plenty better by actually living the dream of many athletes and making a career out of it. So, everyone, welcome back. You've been listening, you've been watching, you know that what we capture here are the reflections and insights of leaders in the legal industry that have decided that they wanted to build a career path that was more intentional for them. There's moments in time where a circumstance, an opportunity came up, or they made a really difficult choice. And I feel like, this is such a cool one for everyone that's into the entertainment space, the sports space, especially, that's always thought about, like, how do I take a career from this passion? And Manav's done this. So the future of law, it's well and alive in your hands, and we're going to find out how you got there. So thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here.
All right, let's kick it off, my friend. So, I'm in Toronto, you're in Vancouver. Lots of love between these cities, but not always on the MLS soccer front. And you're the general counsel, chief administrative officer of the Vancouver Whitecaps, which, for folks that aren't sport or soccer obsessed, professional soccer franchise, and in the US Canadian Professional Soccer League. And it's a big deal. It's a big deal in Vancouver. It's a big deal in Canada. Toronto FC fans may feel a little bit differently, but it is a big deal that you're GC of the Vancouver Whitecaps. I think it's extremely cool because I spent so much of my life playing soccer. So, right off the top, I would love to hear, I know you've had a couple different roles at the org, but I would love to hear the day that you got that offer and just how you felt. Was it like, I can't believe this is a reality? Or how did you feel that day when you found out that you were going to be, a lawyer for a professional sports team?
Mixed emotions for sure, right? Like as you said, like soccer has been a big part of my life growing up since like day one, right? Playing, watching, all of it. So when I first got my offer from my current boss, Axel Schuster, who's former sporting director of Schalke, right? It was just so surreal, right? I'm like, holy shit! Like I'm working for a professional soccer team, and I'm working for this guy, right? It was an amazing feeling. But then immediately just got to work. But yeah, mixed emotions in a lot of ways, but mostly just surreal that I was working for a professional team, and also it was also surreal because I was moving from Edmonton for the first time, right? So moving to Vancouver for the first time. But yeah, surreal as hell.
And was there like you got this incredible job opportunity and you're moving to, Edmonton's a great city, you're moving to another great city, different environments, different climates, away from, the network that you knew. Was there fear in there? Like when I think about people really going after something big and different and scary than everyone's doing, sometimes there's a fear that can either hold us back or make us trepidatious about how we're going to take on that role. Or were you just so excited to be doing this with your life that fear piece wasn't really too noisy for you?
Yeah, I wouldn't say no fear, right? Because it was sort of it was a dream for a long time, right? So at that moment, there's no fear, but then there's other considerations, right? Having to start planning right away. Wouldn't describe it as fear. I'd been trying to get into the sports industry for a while, even before I married my wife, right? Like said, look, this is my dream, and I could end up like anywhere on the continent, right? At the time, I was in the hockey business. Like, end up in Columbus, Ohio. We're nothing against Columbus. We love the crew. But at the time, I said, this is just part of the deal, part of the arrangement. So when that offer came in, we were about to move. My first sort of comment to her was like, at least it's beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia, and not anywhere else, right?
Yeah, that's not a bad deal. That's not a bad. How did you know? Like, I mean, I know that you were a high level soccer player, but like, there's lots of high level soccer players. I was one of them too. Like, how did you know that this thing was meant to be what your professional life, not just your sporting life, was meant to be? Like, was it always with you? How did you know? Because so many of us go through it thinking, that'd be pretty cool. And then we move off into some other direction. But you knew that you would move anywhere for this. What was it that was telling you inside you had to chase this thing that was so meaningful for you?
And I think everybody, when they play high level soccer, you probably went through this, that moment that you realize when you're a kid that, I'm actually not going to make it pro, right? It's not like a nice, it's not a nice admission to yourself, right? When I had that ambition, probably later than it should have came, I just thought to myself, like, I want to stay in the game some way or in sports some way, right? So from then on in, everything was done it was actually to become a player agent at first, right? But everything I did was cater towards working in pro sports, right? Like I come from a Punjabi family, so there's a lot of academic pressure, right? And my parents always wanted me to go to law school, right? So then I made them a deal too. I said, okay, fine, I'll go to law school, right? But just so you know, I'm going to be a lawyer, but I'm probably going to leave the practice of law to pursue this other career, player agency. And they're just like, yeah, you're an idiot. Just go to law school and you'll be fine. Finish law school, practice for a couple of years, and then trying to become a player agent, right? So it was just always from that moment of, admitting to myself that I was going to be a pro player. I wanted to be in pro sports. And then one thing led to another.
Is this part of how, like, I'm seeing this little trend here about you're a pretty proactive, transparent communicator? Your wife, your parents, like, yeah. Okay, we're going to do this, but just so you know, I'm probably going to go over here. Is that how you practice too? Do you find that that's been, like, if you look back, pretty like core to how you've always been a professional in terms of being a lawyer and being an agent? Is that like that proactive, transparent thing? Is that always something that's core to you?
So I think it's probably a core tenet of my practice, like proactive communication. I mean, there's always a balance, right? Because sometimes proactive communication can, create concern with your clients and your colleagues, right? But yeah, I would say generally try to be proactive for upcoming risks, right? Nobody likes being surprised. Certainly the people that I work with don't, right? So it's better to be proactive and, throw out some potential solutions in advance of.
Yeah. You've got enough hearts pumping with your parents wondering if you're going to be a lawyer, your wife wondering where you're going to live, watching the games on the field. You don't need to add too much more adrenaline to it. You've got enough going on in your life already. Okay, so I want to ask you, though, about the hockey player agent. And I mean, of course, MLS is growing in leaps and bounds, and it has been, last 5, 10, 15 years. And when you first were thinking you wanted to get into the business of sports, hockey's a much more natural choice for people in North America, right? Like way more teams, way more money, especially at that time. But that wasn't your sport of choice. Did it matter to you that your dream was in sport, but it was being taken down a sport that, I'm presuming wasn't as core to you as soccer was? Or was it just for you, like, if I can be in sport in any way, in any shape and form, I will just go after it?
Yeah, I think the latter. And hockey was big for me in a different way, right? Like in Edmonton, big Oilers city, right? So we were massive fans growing up. And one thing led to another. Like the idea of being a player agent always resonated with me, right? Like I watched Jerry Maguire, obviously everybody's watched that movie. And one of the biggest agents just happened to be like one of the biggest agents, hockey agents probably of all time, I would say. Rich Winter just happened to have his office out of Edmonton, right? Represented a bunch of the Oilers in the 80s. So had a sort of goal of being in professional sports. There was this guy in Edmonton that was one of the best in the business. I'm from Edmonton and we were big Oiler fans. So basically I want to be like that guy, right? And that's where I ended up working, by the way.
And so, so take us down that journey of like, okay, so you're on this path and it seems to be everything that you thought as a kid in the City of Champions, with the Oilers, historically having all the success. Now you're aligning yourself with one of the biggest sports agents. how did it feel in terms of like, oh, well, maybe that wasn't going to be the outcome forever? Like, what happened during that journey where you're like, oh, maybe this pull back to soccer, was it just an opportunity that with the Whitecaps that they posted it and you're looking for it? Or did something change when you were pursuing this path that you're like, this isn't quite it?
Yeah, I'd say like when working with the agency, there's always like this sort of internal battle, right? Whether you want to be on the player side, right? And after being in the player side for a decent amount of time, I just didn't like the sales side of it, to be honest, right? Like selling, because you got to be able to sell your services to players and players of, a wide range of ages, I'll say, right? Didn't like that aspect of it. And then also really like the idea of, team success playing soccer. So I said, like, I think I want to try that out. And then I basically and Rich helped me out too. I called basically everybody in the industry to try getting an idea of what it was like on the other side. And then, one thing led to another. Just basically same thing. Just try calling every MLS team, or every Canadian MLS team, and then every NHL team as well.
That's you make it sound like it's pretty easy that you just pick up the phone and call everyone, but it's actually an attribute that is very uncomfortable for a lot of folks, or they just don't want to do it. And did you, like, as a kid, were you always someone that was like, no, I'll just like knock on a door and pick up the phone and go after it? Was it something your family pushed, or like, how is that attribute so easy for you to say, like, just call the Canadian MLS teams and see what happens?
Well, yeah, probably the way I'm saying it now, it probably doesn't like give you insight into how like stressful it is at the time, right? So don't take that the wrong way. My older brother was just always a guy that like, you just got to pick up the phone and call people. If you want something, just do it. And me and my brothers are very close, so I always got advice from them. But yeah, it was like, and before every call, right? It's like I'm called like going down my list of agents or GMs, right? And then you've got like 5 seconds when you call them too, right? Most of them just hang up the phone. So it's like, no, this is who I am. I work with so-and-so. 5 minutes, please. And it's something I learned from my brother, but I was still nervous every time I did it, to be honest. And I still am sometimes when you call people that you aspire to be.
How do you fight through that? Like, you probably got a lot of people like just slamming down the phone and not listening to you, and you kept battling through it. And so take us back to like, because there's a lot of folks that are listening to this that are looking at you saying like, okay, he fought through it. He got there. It's hard, but he's doing something that he cares about. And I would love to do that. But between, not being there and being there is like a lot of grit and resilience and people not answering your phone calls. And how did you get through it when people were just hanging up phone calls? Because for a lot of folks, it would make you feel like you can never do it and no one thinks you're valuable enough to do it. And so how did you get through that?
Yeah, I think you just remember the times where it works, right? When you have like a positive response, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, this can work. And I got that, I got that from, I'll tell you a quick story. I got that from Rich when, how I ran into him was literally, he came and was speaking at the law school, right? And of course, it's chock full of all the students and everybody wants to get with him afterwards, right? So there's like a big lineup. I'm like, how am I going to talk to this guy, right? This guy's like, it's going to be so difficult. So I basically just wait until he's leaving the classroom, right? Starts putting on his jacket and he's leaving. And then run down the hallway and just pull him aside and was like, hey, Rich, like, this is who I am. Like, I'm a law student, MBA. I want to be like you, right? Like, basically, I'll do whatever it takes. I want to be like you. Just give me a shot. And he's like, whatever. I'm late to pick up my wife, I think he was. So he left. And then like 2 weeks later, he called the school and he goes, I met some East Indian guy in the hallway. Can you like put me in touch with him? Right. And that was just a complete shot in the dark. So, if you're worried about picking up the phone, right? I just think back to moments like that where you just got to shoot your shot, things work out. And if it doesn't, who cares? Right. Nobody's going to follow you for picking up the phone, calling them or running after them in a hallway.
Yeah, I think you've tapped into something I try to think about a lot, which is like this like intentional rewiring that we have to do sometimes, because when we don't try to remember those moments, naturally humans can be drawing negative inferences, and we can assume that things are going to be negative forever when we've had a bad circumstance. I know that can happen to me. And I think your reflection and tip there for folks is like, yeah, when you do something that's like shooting your shot, you're going to miss, but like you're going to hit a couple or get close. And you actually have to almost say it out loud to yourself, like, oh, that thing worked when I tried that, to almost bring it into reality instead of just dismissing it as like a fluke, because we actually have to do that work in order for our brain to be like, it's okay. Try again, try again. And so then what happens? So he finds you, he doesn't even know who you are. He's just relying on the law school to put you in touch. Yeah. And then how did you convince him or how did he convince you that like, yeah, you should shoot your shot?
Well, it was over last year, just sort of like an internship type thing, right? It's just one of those classic stories. I'll do whatever it takes. I just want to learn from you. What can I, how can I get into the business, right? Gave me a couple assignments to work on, of course, like failed my exams, not failed, but like exams. I just worked on these assignments for Rich, turned them around as soon as I could. And then he's like, okay, sure, let's get this thing going. And that was basically it. But I agree with your like rewiring comment, by the way, right? I think sometimes you gotta, when you're like, what's the next thing? At public speaking, right? When you're nervous about something, getting on stage, sometimes it helps to tell yourself that you're excited, right? Before you, like, this is exciting. I'm going on and talking to 50 people. That's an exciting thing. When you bring that into life, you become less nervous. And I think that's similar to what you were talking about earlier.
Totally. And I think a reason why we don't do that is because it seems either like too simple or too silly. And so then I think as lawyers, especially, we've been taught that good things are painstaking. And that if it wasn't like brutal on your existence, then it's no good. Versus like just telling yourself like, oh, I chased that guy down the hall and that thing kind of turned out. So that might be something. Like that just seems like a nothing. And so then we just ignore it and we just say like, oh yeah, I studied for 8 billion hours and I got a B+. And so I guess that's good. And, it's like you have to remind yourself of when the outcome made sense for like your purpose and your effort. And if we don't remind ourselves and we just get caught in this like fast moving river of like painstaking effort for things we're not even sure if they really matter to us. And, but for you, you're like, okay, in law school, you get this internship, but then you did work at like a well-known Alberta law firm for a couple of years. And your parents were probably like, perfect. We knew that he wasn't actually going to go do that thing, but you still had like this card up your sleeve. And so what did they say after, you're working at a well-known firm, you're doing your thing there, your parents are pumped, it's all going according to plan. And then you're like, not so fast. Remember when I told you a few years ago, I'm doing that thing. What was their reaction when you said, I'm leaving this firm to become a player agent?
Yeah, that's interesting. My parents, they remember everything, right? But when it comes to things like that, it's a very, very short memory, conveniently. But it was shocking for them, to be honest. I mean, they're your parents, though. They quickly turns into support, right? It was more so, and they were concerned, right? Because the profession at a well-known firm, which was, by the way, McLaren Ross was like an amazing experience as well. I still love those guys. But there's assumption from like my parents' perspective, and I think of a lot of people from their generation, that working at a law firm, like a classic law firm, provides a lot of stability, which it does, right? And so they're worried about like my security and stability going forward. And that was sort of the reaction, but then they quickly turned into support. They saw that I was happy doing what I was doing, right? And it seemed to all work out so far.
For, like I've taken a couple of big gambles too. Like I left a national law firm to travel around the world. I gave up my GC job to take 3 months to figure out what I was going to do before I started my own advisory business. So, I've shocked my parents a couple of times as well, although I expect they get less shocked each time. But for you, when you're, because this was like, you're only what, like 2-3 years out of, like, you're still a young lawyer when you made the first big jump from a real law firm to a professional, to player agent. How did you, other than your parents seeing that you were happy, for all the folks that are thinking, my parents would never go for that, how did you reassure them, either through your actions or your words or through conversation? Like, I'm thinking about everyone that's listening that's saying like, but I need a tip here about how I get through those conversations. Thinking back, what was really effective for you?
Well, first of all, when you take these types of risks and you have a law degree, like, in some ways they're perceived risks, too, right? Like I don't even know if it's a real risk because like you always have the ability to go and practice law, right? Like for me, I was taking my law degree and try to do what I wanted. So and if it didn't work out, I just told them that, I can just go back and I'll figure it out. It's not gonna be the end of the world. But I think that, you're able to see it, your parents are able to see it, everybody around you is able to see it when you enjoy your work, right? Especially people that care about you. They're able to see it. So it's just do what you want to do. It's hard for me to say anything else. And it's also sometimes a risk. Do what you want to do. And sometimes the risks are just perceived risks. You always have the ability to go back into the practice of law. I think most people do.
I think that's right. I've also felt like, and I think, you have a young family as well. And so do I, that like your energy is contagious either way. Like if you're not happy, that energy is also contagious in your life around like everyone that is most important to you, that you are bleeding that negative energy into, versus when you are feeling impactful and fulfilled or content in your professional life, that positive energy also bleeds into other people. And both of them are examples. And so there really is like a no risk-free scenario, because if you are doing a job that pays you, kind of an annuity and you're able to do that job, sure. But if you're unhappy or feeling negative about it, you're creating risk as well.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. There's and exactly. I found like staying in, just for me personally, and by the way, I'm very much back in the practice of law. That staying in sort of a private practice scenario was very risky for me from a personal perspective, right? Because I was risking being unhappy, because that's not sort of the life I wanted long term. I wanted to work in sports. So there's a risk either way. And, sometimes it's personal, sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's stability, whatever. Right. So I think that's a good point.
And so when you're taking big risks, when you have a family or a partner, that's also different than when you're taking risks just as a single individual. And so, you're telling your partner, FYI, like, this is a life that I want to live. And, I don't know, between cities that are warm weather, cold weather, rural, urban, I don't know, because the job's got to be available to me. And so what was her reaction to that? And, because her career might be impacted by it. And so what was her reaction when you're kind of foreshadowing there's this uncertainty to where my path is going to go?
Very trusting, I guess, right? So she's pretty good with it, right? So I guess that's the key there. Find a partner that trusts you. And disclosure is always a good thing, right? Advanced disclosure. But I don't think she actually even really fully processed it until, similar to my parents, until it actually happened, right? But of course, was very supportive when I wanted to leave private practice. But yeah, no, I have nothing else to say other than really lucky to have her support and just sort of be with me and trust that, I'm going to do the right thing for us and our family, right? And she's also sort of seen that throughout, sort of have like a don't give up mentality, right? I've always been sort of relentless in my approach, and she's trusting in that approach, I guess.
She knows you chase people down hallways to make sure that it happens.
Yeah. Or she's like, this idiot's going to do what he wants anyway. So like, I'll let him do it.
It's funny because when you're talking about like the advanced disclosure is, I think about that a lot, with my partner and our family, is that you need to, one big insight I've had, especially, becoming a dad, which really changes your even partner relationship and your family dynamic, because now you're both responsible for this other being, is figuring out the type of communication the other person really responds to. Like, some people like a lot of advanced disclosure. Some people like to be a bit more in the moment. And like you said earlier, they don't like too much advanced disclosure because it creates too much theoretical risk and they have no idea how to quantify it yet. And so how have you, as a professional growing such an atypical career and, law firm, and then as player agent, and then I'm not sure I wanted to do that. And I thought that was the thing. I was chasing the guy down the hallway. It's not that anymore. I want to go inside to a team. I want to move cities to follow that dream. For folks that have a partner or contemplating having, a long-term partner in their life and want to choose something with less certainty, is more atypical, What's your best advice for how you've navigated that on the relationship side and how you've learned to do that as your careers become even more demanding with the Whitecaps? Like, what is it that you're learning about being a great partner and a great parent to balance those two things?
That's a tough question and a loaded one. But I think there's got to be compromise, right? And you have to accept that. When you have, like, regardless of where you work, if you have a busy job, there needs to be compromise and going both ways, right? But I think that what I'm learning, especially after having kids, is, you need to set time aside for your children, right? At least you need to isolate a time, separate and apart from work, in order to be like a good parent. That's just a belief that I have, right? So what I've learned after having kids is that, I think I'm probably more efficient than I thought I was, right? Like, in terms of it, just like I just have to do things in a less amount of time. I don't know how else to do it. So my advice is that, push yourself to be more efficient in terms of, your dedicated hours, and then you got to set aside dedicated hours for your personal life and career, right? Otherwise, what's the point? That's sort of, so you're more efficient than you think you are, and set aside dedicated time for your family and friends.
Yeah. And it's funny, those types of things too, sometimes they feel too simple. It's like, oh, do I really have to like block time in my calendar? Like, I block time in my calendar for working out, for sharing my reflections on LinkedIn. Like, it's still in my calendar. And it's not that it's such a muscle memory, but I still want it there as like a forced push every day. And even if I don't do it every day, it's still staring at my face every day in my calendar. And so, that's kind of like it makes sure that I don't become lazy about the time. And I very much agree with, like, there's those precious hours kind of after school before bed with a kid, especially when they're young, where those are the hours that they're awake and they need you and they're forming a bond with you. And if you have to work earlier or later, then you have to, because if you get lazy about the time, you will just eat into the time, because there's infinite amount of work you can do, especially of a GC of a big brand with lots of demand, lean legal team. There's infinite number of things you could do to fill the time, but you will burn yourself through if you don't put in the fuel to your family and to yourself. And, when you think about this very cool job that you have now, what is it that you're pushing for yourself in terms of how you're trying to grow your career? Like, what is the future of being a GC, of a big brand, of being on the business side of law? Like, what is the future of your practice and what you think the future of law looks like to you? What matters most to you right now?
Personally, like, I think, so in terms of my role, it's changed over time, right? Like, at first I joined the club as their first lawyer, right? So I had to develop the legal department from scratch. And it was just an isolated, I wasn't the general counsel officially at the time, but for all intents and purposes, I was GC. And then over time, my scope expanded, and now I oversee a few other areas: HR, IT, community, facility ops, that sort of thing. So just the administrative function of the club. But like, in terms of how it's evolving, like, very concerted, active, everyday effort to learn, or like deeply understand our business, MLS business, global soccer business, in addition to the legalities, right? And I think that's just every GC I talk to these days, right? Like, you're not sitting around a boardroom table and just giving this like isolated sort of advice when like an isolated legal issue comes up, right? Like, your colleagues expect you to understand deeply the business strategy of an organization. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. But how do you do that? Like, it looks different to everyone, and lots of folks are going to be like, yeah, I've been told to understand the business. So like, what does it look like for you inside the Whitecaps?
I think it's like a concerted effort it's more conversational, right? Like, when you can get a lot out of your internal clients by just spending like a little bit more time with them, right? So, talking like our partnership lead who, sells partnerships experiences with the club, right? When I have to ask him a question about like a sort of isolated legal issue, I maybe extend the conversation for 20, 30 minutes and start learning about like how his business is going, And they appreciate it too, because it's like there's a double benefit there. You learn more about the business, you earn trust from your client. You develop better relationship. You sort of get over this common misconception that like lawyers don't really know anything about business, right? Spend a bit more time with your internal clients is how I do it, at least, or at least I try. They probably still don't think I know anything about business, but you know what I mean.
I'm sure they love you. I thought of this a lot as enthusiasm plus curiosity. And so when I was at Indigo or I was at like a tech portfolio, one thing I started training my brain around very quickly is when a business team brings something to the legal team, it's not like day one that this thing is happening. Like this has probably been happening for months, if not years, in terms of like a buildup of a campaign or a new event or a partnership or a product or whatever it is that like tons of teams have been working on this. And I think one challenge for lawyers, especially lawyers coming straight out of law firms, is we think law is the entire pie. It's like all that we need to think about and it's all that matters, when really it's one slice of the pie and often not a very big one in comparison to, money, brand, the ops, whatever it is that, you're talking about. And so I feel like I used to train my brain to be like, well, if I'm just enthusiastic about their effort instead of being cynical, and then I'm curious about the journey of how they got there, it feels a lot like what you said, which is they're first of all surprised. Legal team's real interested in what we're up to. That's cool. Totally. They think it's cool. They don't think it's stupid or full of risk. And so then they're like, oh, sure. Like, let me tell you, because what you're doing there is you're actually asking them about what they know and they care about. Lawyers spend too much time talking to people about the law. They didn't go to law school. They don't want to be a lawyer. You got to talk to them about their business. And then you need to figure out how the law fits within what they do. And when you do that, business teams love talking to you, and then they start bringing stuff to you proactively. Does that feel like what it looks like for you at the Caps?
I'd like for it to look that way all the time, right? Everybody can improve. That's where I want to be in ideal state, I would say. But you explained it really well. The curiosity, enthusiasm, nobody wants to hear you talk about the law other than lawyers. Like no, at all, right? Nobody wants a summary of the applicable legislation. Nobody cares, right? No,
it's terrible.
It's terrible. Yeah, it's terrible. Like they just don't want to hear that. They don't want to talk to lawyers. But I guess, and I think what you're leading to is if you start talking to them about their business and then take that away and sort of analyze it, then you do your legal analysis without them and come back to them with a solution, then they will be grateful, right? If you're in conversation telling them why you can't do something, right? As things come up, they're gonna be like, I don't like dealing with this guy. I don't want to talk to the legal department. Simple as that.
And then they'll just stop telling you, and they're going to do it anyway. They're going to do it anyway. And so then what's really happening? I used to think about it a lot as like if I'd explain that concept and I would get like some deer in the headlights, what I would say is just think about yourself in like a personal conversation in a group of people. Who do you like more? The person who's like, hey, Manav, like, that's so cool, man. Like, how'd you do that? That's a cool weekend activity. Tell me more about that. Or the person who talks to you about their personal hobby without asking you anything. It's very obvious who you want to talk to. And then you're inclined, once they're done asking you about stuff, to ask them. And so then you get into this mutually beneficial, curious, warm conversation instead of just up on the hill telling everyone about the laws when most lawyers are bored by the conversation, never mind the business unit. So, it sounds like, you're doing all the right things, which is, why your career has grown in this way. So let me ask you these three final rapid fire questions though, which is like, okay. So number one is if you think about, people who they're at an earlier stage than you, maybe you at like McLennan Ross, and you're like, I've got this idea. I want to do it. Not exactly sure if I will be able to do it. What would be your best advice for maybe the Manav that was a little bit less certain if you're going to be able to pull it off? Like what would be the encouragement or the one piece of advice after all these years later you would want to tell that earlier version of yourself?
Yeah, probably just, really, you got to ask yourself whether you want to be in private practice for your entire life, right? I think you get a pretty good taste for what the experience is like within a couple of years, right? People know or people don't. If it's not for you, right, then make a concerted effort to ask yourself what you want to do with your life every day, right? And the answer is that it could change. It's not going to be clear to you, right? And just trust that there's options available, right? If you don't, and this is not like a knock on private practice either, right? It's just if that is not for you, you can do other things with a law degree that surely can bring happiness to you.
I like this part around the concerted effort. You've mentioned that a few times around, like, clearly that's something that, is a through line for you, but like, okay, well, if you reflect on something and you think it's this, and to your point, the decision you make doesn't have to be the end game. You thought you wanted to be a hockey player agent and you had built that path and it didn't end up being the thing. But the point is you built the muscle memory around making a concerted, focused effort on something you believed you cared about. And that then opened the next door. Because if you hadn't been a player agent, I imagine it would have been harder to convince the Whitecaps with zero professional sport experience to make you their first lawyer. I'm sure that was a big benefit in your candidacy that you had made your way into sport as in the legal and business side. So I love that piece around the concerted effort. The second thing I want to ask you is for folks that are quite scared about having an atypical career path. They're in the law firm or they're in like a more typical in-house role at maybe a big FI or something. And you're going to take a gamble on yourself and work for a brand, maybe be the first lawyer, all the kind of things that you did, which are less certain. What would you want folks to know about operating in an atypical career path? That was either something hard you had to get over or something super rewarding you didn't expect.
What I want people to know that are considering operating in an atypical career path.
Yeah.
So everybody has their own path, right? I think, at least for me, a lot of people that I looked up to, right, they had atypical career paths. So not everybody gets the same outcome, like a certain outcome in the same way. It's more common than you think. And atypical paths are just more fun too, right? You meet people along the way, and there's a lot to learn on it, from other people, right? So when you try new things out, you also learn a lot more, and then you take those things with you, right? And you become more dynamic, right? There's one interaction that I had with a former executive of the Winnipeg Jets, right? And this is during my time of sort of connecting with people and trying to get advice. And his advice was, he's just like, just put yourself in situations, right? You don't necessarily have to be asking people for opportunities or jobs, but put yourself in situations where you're going to be surrounded by people that you're going to learn from, right? In a way that's going to help you achieve the professional outcomes that you want, right? So then, sort of volunteering on sort of boards and that sort of stuff. That's sort of a roundabout answer. Hopefully it makes sense. But I guess to summarize, I'd say atypical career paths are a lot of fun, right? There's a lot, it's more common than you think. That's a bit of a misnomer, but a lot of people get to a good outcome by not going through, the typical career path, I guess. And just surround yourself with people that you think you can learn from and benefit from.
I also like that piece that you got the advice on about putting yourself in the room. And there's lots of ways to do that. And volunteering is a great way to do it. Trying to get on some sort of committee that needs support is like, it has a double fold. It's like you're in the room immediately and you get to learn. You get to test very quickly about whether you're going to make a massive career shift potentially just by getting some of the experience. Because sometimes we think we really want to do something. We get a bit of experience and we're like, oh no, that wasn't really for me. But you have to test and learn it, especially if you're going to make some big shifts. I really recommend testing and learning. And I think putting yourself in the room creates community, creates connection. It gives you a chance to test. So I love that one. Last one for you, which is what is something that we haven't talked about that you'd want people to know either about your career or where you think the legal industry is going, what you hope for the legal industry that we haven't had a chance to talk about that's very meaningful for you and your career right now, really top of mind for you?
Yeah. So I think that's a good question. I think that the scope of opportunities for legal professionals are expanding, linking back to something I said earlier, right? Like I think that people are starting to recognize that lawyers have like a more dynamic skill set than, was once perceived, right? And I think the scope of opportunities are expanding. And I think that, and maybe it could be anecdotal and just based on who I work with, but a lot of people in the legal industry in sport end up in executive positions in sports, right? But they do that by sort of, adding to their legal expertise with other things, right? So basically what I would say is the scope of opportunities for legal professionals are expanding, in my view, because I also think the mindset of lawyers is changing, and lawyers are sort of taking more of a concerted effort, use that word again, to understand like the business side of the companies that they work for.
Well, we can see how this is even playing out for you. Like you're not just general counsel anymore. You have a whole bunch of functions underneath you that are operational in many respects in terms of directly what happens on the field with the facilities, and also the background infrastructure with IT and the talent that actually makes the whole ship run. So, your portfolio of functions is in number broader on the business side than it is on the legal side. And I think if we think about, everything you've shared around like following your passion for the industry, following your like instinct to go after it and chase it down and be resilient and be focused and concerted on it and willing to take bets on yourself, like that's the type of mindset that is the future of law, I think. And, for folks that aren't sure that it's possible, I mean, we're talking to someone who made it happen, but it doesn't just happen. I think you really have to put in the concerted effort and be reflective and take some bets on yourself, because it's not a straight line. Like you could think you want to be a hockey agent and then you end up becoming GC and CAO of a professional soccer team. And so, but it doesn't happen unless you put in the work to try to find the through line. And I think you're the example of that.
Well, I appreciate that. You just gotta believe in yourself, I guess.
Oh, you've done it, my friend. And thank you so much for your journey, your reflections, and spending the time and sharing for all those who are, they want to bet on themselves, but sometimes we need a little bit of inspiration. Sometimes we need a little bit of tools in order to like get through that next phase so that our career can be more impactful and more fulfilling. And, I just think the reward is very much worth the risk. And, I've felt it and experienced it myself multiple times, and seeing it and hearing it from your journey, deeply resonated, my friend. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thank you everyone else for listening. And we'll see you on the next episode of the What You're About podcast. See you, everyone.